You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast that showcases the research currently being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany. My name is Christopher Murphy, and I'll be sitting down with researchers to talk about their projects, the various methods they use, and how their findings have impacted legal, criminological and psychological research in Germany and abroad. All this and more on Doing Time, Talking Crime. Well, thank you for once again joining us on Doing Time, Talking Crime. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing some late-stage results from a study at the Institute called the Virtual Burglary Project. The project uses virtual reality to assess criminal behaviour and decision-making processes. We're also going to be talking about the challenges involved in conducting fieldwork in prisons. To do so, I'm joined today by Patrick McClanahan. Patrick is a postdoc at the Institute's Department of Criminology and has just returned from a 6-month stint in the field in the United States. He's here today to tell us about his findings and to detail his experiences during this time. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah. Now, I guess I should tell our listeners or warn them ahead of time that you and I had a chat about this beforehand, and you've got so much interesting research and findings to tell us about that we've actually decided to break this interview down to 2 separate podcasts. Basically, we didn't want to condense it because we felt there was just too much there. So we're going to get 2 podcasts out of this, which I'm very happy about. Because we've got so much information, let's get going. Why don't you tell me about what you're actually researching in the Virtual Burglary Project?
Yeah, so first of all, let's kind of take a step back and remember that crime is a hidden behavior. And for us as researchers, that makes it very difficult to study. People obviously don't want to be seen committing a crime. And in most instances, a researcher cannot be present at the time of a crime. So, and we also, ethically, we
unless
can't...
they want it to be an accessory,
Unless they wanted to be an accessory as well, hiding behind it. Right. The thing. Ethically, we also can't create a situation where someone could commit an actual crime. Mm-hmm. So that really makes it very difficult for us to study the thing we're interested in the most, which is criminal behavior. So researchers have had to get very creative over the years in how the methods that we use to study crime, what we're most interested in. And as technology has advanced, we can now use virtual reality to study crime, which is exactly what I do in my project. I also want to note that this project is part of a larger project, the big umbrella term being the Virtual Burglary Project. That's kind of headed up by both my supervisors, Jean-Louis Van Gelter and Claire Nee. And in this project and in the whole thing that we do, whether it be my specific portion or several portions across the country, we harness the power of VR to examine criminal decision-making and test a lot of criminal theories.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In the broadest sense, regardless of which project it is, we invite convicted burglars to come into our virtual labs, commit a burglary in VR, and in doing so we can test theories, understand criminal behavior better, and then we can go on to inform policy and make our streets safer.
Okay. Very noble goals there, absolutely. You talk about harnessing the power of virtual reality. Tell us more about this power. What makes virtual reality such an impressive tool for this type of research?
So VR is an exciting blend of a field study and a traditional laboratory experiment. You know, field studies are great because we have this high degree of validity. We know we're looking at crime or we know we're looking at this behavior, but we're less precise and we have a lot of noise because we're not controlling everything. There's this real life is happening right then and there. So we kind of have a little bit of an error, if you will. And lab studies have a high degree of control. They're very sterile, they're very clean, but then we have the problem of not actually studying true crime in some instances. So we kind of have that inability to kind of generalize to the real world, if you will.
Just a little question there. When we say lab study, that's obviously not in a laboratory.
Correct. Not in a laboratory.
Yeah.
It could be something as simple as an online survey or... It could be in a lab in the sense that we have a lab at the department where we have the Max lab, which is our virtual reality lab, where people can come into the building and we do experiments there. Yeah. But again, the behavior usually isn't a true crime.
Right.
And so therefore it's, if we actually put someone in the real world, would the behavior be the same? That's the difference between the lab study and the field study.
Thank you.
And so VR can kind of take the best of both worlds and puts them into a single method. We can run true, randomized, controlled experiments like a lab study where we can manipulate what is happening. We control every aspect. And through that manipulation, we can see how the presence of this thing influences behavior or decision making. We can also make sure that other factors that we don't care about remain constant, so we don't have to worry about that noise that I was talking about in a field study. And the idea of the VR is that we have that realistic aspect that you do get from the field study, the high degree of realism. With my research, I had a number of participants that would say, are you sure, this looks exactly like my house, this looks exactly like my neighborhood. Okay. And that's something you don't necessarily get when you're just reading a situation from a paper. So that's what's great about the VR. And one of my favorite things is the lack of delay. When you use virtual reality, everything's happening then and there. So we get that offender perspective as it unfolds. We don't have any memory issues from asking them to think about a situation 5 years ago, a year ago, or even a month ago. Everything's happening right then and there. So that really kind of increases our accuracy of what we're talking about.
Certainly, okay. You said, this is your research is part of the broader study on the virtual burglary or from the Virtual Burglary Project. Is this the first time that you yourself have used virtual reality in research?
So actually, this is my second time using virtual reality in my research. My first time was coming from my doctorate degree. And I actually kind of had this realization of exactly what I was speaking of. I felt that these laboratory studies, these online experiments or what have you, just really weren't speaking to what I was thinking about when I was thinking about crime. And I wanted to increase the accuracy to really understand our criminal behavior. And that's when I ran across Jean-Louis's work using virtual reality to study criminal behavior. And very fortunate, I reached out to him and said, I'm interested in kind of using your virtual reality equipment, your virtual reality stimulus, if you will, to study crime for my doctoral thesis. He was very polite and responded quickly and was very happy for me to do that. So that was the first time I got to use virtual reality to study crime. And from there, just kind of built up a working relationship with Jean-Louis and ended up working for him here at the Max Planck Institute.
Okay, right. I wanted to ask a little bit then, I'm going to talk a little bit about virtual reality now and its uses and power. Let's talk a little bit about burglary itself and the literature, the traditional literature, I guess. There's obviously reams of literature that have been written about burglary and what possibly makes a house attractive or unattractive to burgle. Do you want to give us a run-through of these traditional theories and then maybe add a little bit of color about how virtual reality can be used to flesh them out?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think one of the more prominent theories that we think about in criminology, at least from my perspective and a lot of my colleagues, is, first of all, rational choice theory. And in general, rational choice theory says people are decision makers and people want the best outcome for themselves. And so when the risks associated with an outcome are low and the benefits associated with an outcome are high, then that behavior will be chosen. So in this instant, if I think I can get away with this crime and get what I want out of this crime, then the crime will occur.
Rational choice will say.
That rational choice will say. Now, obviously, that's a very stripped down version. There's loads of nuances, but just for the purposes of today, that's the best way to think about it. And when we think about in the context of burglary, a clean example might be if I'm a motivated burglar and I want to break into a house, but I see that there's a car parked in the driveway, that car may signal to me that someone's home, increasing my chances of getting caught, and then what we say, deterring me away from breaking into that house. Okay. And so that's kind of the rational choice perspective, one of the foundational cornerstones, if you will, of our project. Another kind of area of literature that we tap into is generally environmental criminology. And what's different about environmental criminology compared to rational choice is environmental criminology looks at the whole geographic place. Okay. It could be a single house, it could be a street, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a city, a state, country, but it doesn't look at the individual person like rational choice theory does. Rational choice looks at the person and how they make the decision. Environmental criminology looks at the place and see how it relates to crime. Okay. And so this could be something like, okay, if we look at this neighborhood, they have a high degree number of security doorbells with a camera in it. Yes, yeah. And we look at this other neighborhood that they don't. How do their crime rates differ? And that would be the environmental criminology perspective. And then the final kind of feature of literature that's really important to know here is what we just kind of generally call the offender-based perspective, where researchers actually speak to criminals, actually speak to people that have experience with the crime that they're interested in. Yes. And usually this comes from extensive qualitative literature, extensive qualitative interviews, sometimes with active offenders, people who are still out in the real world offending, sometimes with people that have been incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. And that really lets us understand the internal thinking of an offender. in the moment, if you will. But where VR comes in is that a lot of this data is either observational, so we can't really talk to experimental and causal claims, or it's coming from people that aren't necessarily criminals themselves. So you have a different type of issue where we're talking to students, where we're talking to average citizens, does the criminal think differently? So we don't have the ability to make the causal claims that we'd really like to. And more importantly, in some instances, we don't have the ability to know what an offender's actually thinking in that moment.
Right, yes, okay.
So let me give an example to show how this can really result in contested literature. You can imagine that in some instances, a house that has a lot of security, maybe a fence, a camera, maybe automatic lights, for one offender could say, okay, this place is way too hard to get into, way too hard to get into. It's not worth my time. I'm going to get caught if I do it. And
that would be on the offender-based theory.
And that would be the offender-based. That's also incorporating what we know from rational choice.
And also, I guess, environment as well.
In the environment. So they all intersect. They all intersect very nicely. But for the offender that says this is way too risky for me, I'm not going to do it, another offender might come along and say, okay, if you got, what are you protecting in there? Why do you need all this security? What you got in there that's so valuable? Okay. Now I'm interested. But it's hard to know which one is which and why there is this divergence if we don't get to have these true experiments, this offender-based perspective by actually speaking to the offender. So we kind of have to blend all these things together, and that's where virtual reality comes in. We can have this blending of environment. We can have this blending of rational choice. We can have this blending of offender-based perspective, getting the information right from the offender themselves with the true experiment. So with the VR, we have the ability to systematically test and tease apart these relationships to understand what is really happening in the moment, what's really going on in their mind. So when X can mean both risk and benefit, what they're thinking and how they're processing it, it's really important that we kind of get to ask them firsthand.
Okay. Well, you've definitely sold me on the power of virtual reality. I mean, it sounds brilliant. Let's maybe then talk a little less though about, we're going to definitely return to the virtual reality component of the study, but let's talk about the reality component. Tell me about the design of the study that you can currently or just conducted your research for.
Yeah, so in the broadest sense, the virtual environment we created was designed to really assess how the environment can influence a criminal's decision-making. As I just talked about with the rational choice, environmental criminology, and offender-based perspective, we're blending all those things together. And to do this, generally speaking, we purposely manipulated something about a house or a whole neighborhood in this virtual neighborhood that we thought may influence how attractive a target would be to break into. So in this case, how attractive this house might be to break into. Participants then answered questions directly in the virtual reality, and these questions come from the greater literature that we think, these are the things that we think criminals are thinking about.
Right, so that'd be that blending of the traditional literature with the new virtual component.
Exactly. Okay. But with VR, we get this added benefit of things like eye tracking. So we have these eye tracking components where we can observe what an offender is looking at in the moment and then relate that back to our bigger research question.
Certain elements in the VR world that they focus in on.
Yeah, certain elements in the VR world. So if we ask them the question, how attractive is this house to break into? And then through the virtual reality data, we can see what they looked at after reading that question and can kind of tie those elements together. We also have movement data to know where they move about in the neighborhood, what paths they take, what their scouting behavior might be like, how close they get to a house, how far away they stay from a house, these types of things. And then, of course, the big thing with this project is I wanted to speak to actual offenders. I wanted to make sure I spoke to people who had experience and knew what they were talking about. So that's kind of the whole design of the project, if you will. Yeah,
sure, okay. And that ties in nicely to my next question, because I know you did this research with offenders in prisons. So tell us a little bit about how many prisons you visited, where they were, and how many participants you had for the project.
Yeah, so all the prisons were in the state of Pennsylvania. We worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections really closely. They were very supportive and helpful in this endeavor, so that's always great when you get the government. It helps everything run a bit smoother.
How come you went for Pennsylvania?
So myself, another colleague that's involved with the project, we have a good understanding of Pennsylvania. We are familiar with the area. And Pennsylvania has a good history of working with researchers, the Department of Corrections, that is. And so that
wasn't a random choice. It wasn't a random choice. Okay, hey, this is where,
those relationships are really hard to build.
Sure.
And so when you do build a successful relationship with someone that can give you access to that population. It's something you really, nurture, take care of, and continue to build.
Yeah.
In total, I went to 4 prisons across the state of Pennsylvania.
Different styles of prisons, or different security levels, or fairly standard?
Yes and no. It was also hard to tell because at the time this was still when they were, and we still are today in some instances, still dealing with COVID in regards to housing and how things are operating. So to give an example of that is when COVID hit the American prison system, they stopped going to dining halls. All food was delivered to the cell.
To the cell, yeah, okay.
Some prisons I went to still ran that way because they found it reduced issues or fights or just general behavioral issues by allowing the food to be eaten in the cell rather than having all these prisoners come to one area. Other prisons had already gone back to the dining hall. So it was kind of hard to get a feel of, is this like a maximum security or a minimal security prison in that regard, because everything was different, not necessarily because the prison was different.
Yeah, okay. Simply the way it was run post-COVID or during COVID.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
Okay.
But in general, they were anywhere from how they classify their prisons are like level 2, level 3, level 4. And that's usually what type of inmate they can house.
I see.
So then
and
if it's
4 being...
So level 5, I believe, was the highest in Pennsylvania. And sometimes level 5s don't really come out of their housing situation as frequently. And so then I wouldn't necessarily have known they were there.
Okay, I see. Okay,
yeah,
right.
So it's I was never really told if this was a maximum security prison or anything like that.
So the people, the inmates or the participants you were interviewing were kind of, they'd all been in there for a similar crime or...
Yeah, or it was also hard to tell because that was something I didn't want to know in advance. I didn't want to know what their crimes were for because I could bias how I spoke to them.
Gotcha.
But to a more direct point, I think the starkest difference was the age of the prison. When you talk about these differences in prison, I had the fortunate luck to go to the oldest prison that's still operating in Pennsylvania and the newest prison, or the second newest, I believe, and to see those differences.
What date is the oldest one from, roughly?
The oldest one was the early 1900s, so like over 100 years old, but I can't remember the exact.
And so to see the prison design and the way...
The prison design was very different. You know, your classic iron bars, still very key operated, rather than a lot of the newer prisons have the control room with the button operations and things like that. The general aesthetic, once you're inside, you know, some of the areas that I was in the prison doing the testing could almost feel like a business conference room in some of these newer prisons. And then in the older prisons, it was still very apparent I was in a prison. So that was an interesting comparison as well.
And how many then across the 4 prisons, how many participants did you have?
So in total, I had 160 participants.
160 participants,
So approximately 40 at each, even though some prisons were more or less.
Okay. And then how did you, you obviously here in Germany, lovely Freiburg, that's right, but that makes it a little, I guess, trickier to find participants for a study in prisons in Pennsylvania.
Yes,
yes. How did you find participants? You're obviously relying on, I'm guessing, local authorities partly. And what were the criteria for their inclusion?
So yeah, we did have some very, very clear criteria for inclusion. As I was saying before, I wanted to speak to people that had experience with this crime. But I also want to be able to detect that experience, because something that we know from a lot of the crime research is there's a difference between an expert and an amateur. So I wanted to be able to speak to a range of people with experiences. People that maybe be an amateur burglar, all the way up to your more kind of traditional Italian Job-esque burglars, if you will.
Ocean's 11.
Yeah, Ocean's 11, all of these kind of major heist movies. Because that's when I can be able to detect that there is a difference based on experience or expertise, if you will. And so for part of that criteria, I wanted to make it as wide as possible. I wanted to make sure that as I could get anyone from an amateur to an expert.
I see, okay.
And so to do that, to participate in my study, first of all, we only targeted males. Burglary is predominantly a male offense. It's not solely, but it is predominantly a male offense. But also it kind of helps, and we'll get into this later, hopefully, when we talk some about my experiences. Me being a male and then speaking to a male participant actually helps a lot with the research process. To participate in my study, I wanted to speak to people that had at least one burglary arrest since 2012. Only one and only arrests. So that's a very low
That's
level.
right. Yeah, that's
And so that gets me the guy that was like, well, I've only ever broken into one house in my life, all the way up to the guy that's broken into, several hundred houses.
Okay. But that's obviously going to get you way more than the 160 participants you had,
That
right?
does get me a very much higher number. And I am just a one-man army at the time, if you will, doing these things. So I do still have to prioritize. So there were 2 recruitment strategies used. The first recruitment strategy I kind of label the prison-led recruitment strategy, where I sent the prison my list of requirements. The prison then drafted a list of names that met that requirement.
Okay.
Then I sent the prison a memo that they could circulate around to these inmates and tell them the details of the study, tell them, who I was, what I was coming in for, what they would be doing, what they could expect, all the kind of nitty-gritty of informed consent, if you will. And then if the inmate was interested, they would let the prison know that they were interested. And while this was fairly effective, like I said, so I used this at the first 2 prisons. This was the first of 2 recruitment strategies I used.
That's basically where you sent something from here, a memo to A4 of this is what we're doing. And okay.
And so while it was fairly effective, what I realized through conversations with the inmates as I was collecting the data, there was a lot of differences in how they were approached between the 2 prisons, but as well as who just happened to hand them the memo that day. And I didn't particularly like that because I was concerned that the reason that some inmates might be saying no was simply because the study wasn't being communicated well. But also something that you learn very quickly when doing prison research is if they feel like it's part of the system, if this study is something that the quote-unquote system is doing, that might put up a wall right away.
Okay.
So to have an employee of the prison coming and say, hey, do this study, may not be painted well for them. So for my final 2 prisons I went to, I led the recruitment strategy.
Okay, so you were in the States then at that point?
I was in the state then, and so I led the recruitment strategy, and I kind of changed the recruitment strategies between prison 2 and prison 3. And what I did starting at prison 3 was I said, give me the list of names. Whoever meets that criteria, give me the list of names. Schedule me one 15-minute meeting with everybody on that list. So that would end up with anywhere from 30 to 40 meetings a day for about 3 days a week.
Wow, okay.
And I had my elevator pitch down. The first few were a little rocky, I have to be honest. But you do learn quickly what they care about, what they don't care about, what's going to sell it to them, what type of questions they're going to have. And, I had the very fortunate experience where Jean-Louis was able to visit me for a couple of days in America and see the study there. And he kind of pulled me aside at the end of this visit and said, you have a researcher voice. People will have these different voices when they say so you have a researcher voice. So apparently when I pitched the study, I have a very specific voice and style that I use. And so I did. I had a pitch written down. They'd come in and they really wouldn't know what they were there for. And I say, this is a real quick 5-minute meeting for me to tell you about a research study that I'm working on, tell you a little about it, tell you a little bit about me, what we would be doing, answer any questions you might have, and then you get to decide if you want to do it or not. And then it's like, is that all right with you? And then boom, we're gone. 5 minutes, and they either get to the end of that meeting and they either say yes or they say no.
So you find out immediately basically whether they, so
those that say yes, I just kind of
hone your elevator pitch then,
so I was able to hone it very much in those first couple of days, or this first couple of meetings even. And so at the end of the meeting, they would say yes or no. Those that said yes, I marked as that they were willing to participate. At the end of the day, I would give that list to kind of my contact at the prison, say, okay, schedule these guys for starting on whatever day I would be starting on at that prison. And then we were off. And so I did see a little bit of a better uptake that way. If I had more time, I probably would have had more than 160 participants.
Okay, so you did notice that there was a difference between those 2 prisons and then the latter 2.
Yeah. Obviously, different prisons, different people, so it's hard to say if it was just that strategy. But where I really, really saw the difference was that then the day they came in to do the study with me, it was now the second time they saw me.
Yes, okay.
For those that were recruited by the prison, that was the very first time they ever met me. Right. The moment of the study. So when they would come see me on the time for the actual study, they would remember me. They would be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more open right away. Had a good conversation
before, enjoyed ourselves. Yeah, okay.
They saw that I was consistent. And that's really important for them. So that's where I saw the biggest difference is their behavior on the day of the actual data collection.
Okay. Was there anything in particular that you could win them over with when you were selling the project?
The number one question I would often get, and I understand it, was, why are you doing this?
Okay.
What do you get out of this? Why are you doing this? And what is true, but what I also learned is that you kind of have to reflect how what you're getting out of it also benefits them.
Mm-hmm.
Not in an inorganic way either. If you force it, everyone can tell a liar.
That's right. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Inmates probably better than anyone else.
I was going to say. Yeah.
And so I would tell them, what I really want out of this is to learn how to make our street safer. My street, your street, everyone back home safer. But also, by speaking with you and guys that have experiences like you, we really understand what's happening in the moment. We know what you're thinking about. We get a better understanding of what you're feeling, what you're thinking about, what you're looking at, what you're not looking at, what you care about, what you don't care about. And then we have a better understanding of what's real and what's not real from experts like you. That's when we have a better program.
That's a nice way to say it.
Yeah.
Experts like you.
Experts like you. We can create better programs, both in prisons to help people stop coming into prison, and before they ever get to prison by having programs on the outside. So really showing them that, with the information that you're giving us, you're improving the accuracy of our theories.
Yes.
The same theories that go on to create prevention programs from ever entering prison, as well as rehabilitation programs to reduce recidivism and re-entry into prison. And also the truth of, once we know what's accurate, we can better deter crime in the real world.
Right, okay.
And when I was able to show them how what I wanted out of it would also benefit them, they were pretty sold.
Sweet, yeah. So were you happy with how many you had, and was it enough for you in that sense to...
Well, to kind of parrot what you said, it's never enough. It's never enough. You always want more data. You always want more participants. But yes, overall, I was extremely happy. This was a very huge endeavor, especially considering that I was... doing it by myself. I was the only one collecting the data. So that was quite exhausting of an experience. But yes, I would always want more. But in regards to, am I happy with what I got? Do I think we have enough people to really draw some good conclusions? Absolutely, yes.
You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. So we got our inmates, your participants, and then they've said, yes, you got 160 odd of them, 4 prisons. I'd like to have a kind of a rundown maybe from you about what your average day looked like then when you were actually collecting the data.
Just a normal 9 to 5.
Clock in, clock out. But it was obviously, that's right, it's clearly very different to, your average 9 to 5 day in the office. I know you got lots of interesting stuff to talk about there, so maybe give us a rundown of from mundane things from prison security and whatnot, though. I mean, that's not mundane, but necessary. Not without going so much into the study itself, but just the practicalities of conducting this kind of field work in a prison.
Yeah, so you kind of led right into it nicely. The number one thing is security. Everything about my day revolved around security. The best way to think about it is like airport security. Essentially, I was going in an airport and out of an airport every day.
Okay. Right. Doesn't sound too pleasant.
It's not too pleasant. But it is nice to know that they take it seriously. You never want to see somebody being a little lax with it.
No.
Now, generally, there were ways to get around it to make it as effective as possible. So obviously, virtual reality equipment. I won't sit here and list all the pieces of equipment that I have to run these studies, but it's well above 30 individual pieces of equipment. If I were to have to take that in and out every day, they would have to examine each piece.
Okay.
Unpack it all, put it back together, etc. So each prison was very fortunate and resourceful enough that I was able to store the equipment in the prison during the study time.
Examined once on going in and...
Once in, and then when I finished there, once out.
Once out, yeah.
But then my daily entry, I still had, my personal laptop, my lunch, my notebooks, my pens, my pencil, audio recorder, because for security reasons, you can't leave an audio recorder in a prison. So little things like that you have to adapt to. And really, if I was start my first participant, 7:45, 8 o'clock, I needed to be at the main gate 7:15 to allow for the time to go through security, which was always a bag check, even though it was the exact same documents every time, exact same things every time.
Sure.
They had to have an itinerary of what was to be expected from me each day, and if anything that wasn't on that list was in the bag or vice versa, there was an issue. I had to be escorted from the main gate to wherever the testing center was. So sometimes there were delays because they couldn't find an escort for me right away.
Sure.
Very rare, but that did happen sometimes. Once I got to the testing area, I would set up, depending on which prison I was at, the equipment might have remained up, or I might have to set it up and take it down each day.
Oh, sometimes you had to break it down each day?
Sometimes I had to break it down each day because the room was like multi-use.
I see.
If it was a room that no one else was using, then I could leave it up for that time. Then get ready for the first participant, essentially. And, that included testing all the equipment. So even though if it remained up and nothing changed, I would still run through all the equipment, make sure everything was working, because everybody knows technology is just always consistent.
Right.
Always works. No issues ever with technology. And so testing all the equipment, and then no matter what prison I was at, no matter where I was in the prison conducting the study, each area in the prison has a number of guards, or at least one guard that's responsible for that area.
Yes.
And if an inmate is meant to report to that area at a specific time, they're responsible for getting that inmate there, or at least making an effort to get that inmate there. So how it worked with my study is, like I said, regardless of what recruitment style was done, my contact at the prison would schedule them for me.
Yeah.
They would schedule 3 a day at certain time intervals. On the prisoner's schedule, they would see coming up in the days that they have a call out, is what it's called, to let them know they have to be somewhere for whatever the subject is. Mine, it would say research study.
Yep.
The guards would have the same list of what prisoners are meant to be in their area at what time for what reason. The guard would call down to the prison, to the cell block, and say, we need last name here, number this, at this time for a research study. The guard at the cell block would go over the PA, last name here, inmate number here, please report to blah, blah, blah for a research study. So all this is happening while I'm getting set up for the day.
Yeah.
First inmate comes in, we run the study, it takes anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours. They leave, I have a 30-minute period to clean everything, reset everything, and then while I'm doing that, they're already calling the next inmate.
Oh, wow. Okay.
After that, I have somewhere in there, I throw a sandwich in my mouth, throw some lunch in my mouth, and then we do it one more time, a third time of getting the final inmate there, and then I break it down and have to wait for an escort out. Sometimes my day would end up being longer than necessary because they couldn't get an escort right away, but most of the time it was very, if I finished at 3:30, the escort would be there by 3:45, so it was a little bit manageable.
And so you basically, you were in this room though, or the whole time? You can't just wander off?
Can't just wander off, no. And not only is it not safe, I literally couldn't go so far until I would hit a door that I wouldn't have a key for, or wouldn't have access to. So even like going to the bathroom, I'd have to relay to the guards that I need an escort to the bathroom, not necessarily for safety, but because I cannot get through that door. But it was very, very
almost
different.
A prisoner in a prison, basically.
It was, because obviously in most instances I'm in a room without windows. It's usually an office. It is very. It's like being like an employee at a prison. I won't ever at a prison. I won't ever say I had any idea what it would like to be an inmate. Yeah. But it was a very good eye-opening experience of what that kind of day in, day out looked like when you kind of just lose all track of time. I haven't felt like that since my first job ever. I worked in a kitchen at a hospital. And so you had to be in at 6 a.m. And if you pulled a 12, you were there till 6:30 at night. And in the winter in Virginia, where I'm from, you miss sunrise and sunset. So it gets dark. I haven't felt that way since then. But every prison was a little bit different in regards to the daily regime, if you will. But those were kind of the consistencies through them all. Obviously, you have no internet, you have no cell phone.
They confiscate that as you go in.
You can't even bring it in.
No,
if you were to walk in with your cell phone, you have to then return it to your vehicle. So you can't. It's not even that they confiscate it. You. Some mistakes that I made one time. I accidentally brought a metal cutlery in with my lunch. You can't have metal. So they did confiscate that in the sense that they held it for me. Otherwise, I would have had to return to my car, and they knew that I was on a schedule. They did provide me with some plastic cutlery, so that was nice of them. You have to show them that your anything that you're bringing in that could connect to a network is on airplane mode. Things like that. So there were slight differences between each prison, but in general, that was what a day would look like. And I think at a broader sense, for me, we were talking about that kind of getting an impression of what it would be like to be in a prison all day. What really stuck out to me is that in academia, we're very fortunate to have a profession that very rarely every day look the same. Very, very rarely. Either you're reading something different, you're rerunning analysis, things like that. Even if you might be doing things that are slightly the same, you're still getting somewhere different.
Sure.
When I was doing this, it was very regimented, very the same thing 3 times a day. And for example, to have a participant participate, they have to give informed consent. To avoid potential literacy issues, I read all this information aloud. So a 3-page informed consent 3 times a day for 6 months.
Wow.
By the time I got to the end of this, I was like, I hope I never have to say these words again.
Maybe a tape recorder would be a good idea.
A tape recorder would be a good idea in the future. Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are one of the things that you kind of realize on participant 17. Like, I should have done that slightly different.
Yeah, but that's, as you said, the learning experience.
It is the learning experience.
And it is, I mean, I guess sometimes the inmates are probably, well, often, I guess, if they were participating, they were probably excited to be there, like, hey, this is something new. And for them, it was an interesting part of the day. But of course, for you, it's, as I say, this is number 50, number 100, number 150. It's, I mean, you're obviously giving it your all on that. But yeah, as you say, it was a very clockwork kind of experience there. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I did everything. I was very fortunate to have some kind of mentorship, if you will, from Professor Candace Cushnet, who has done a lot of in-prison research, and she gave me a lot of guidance on the small details that you can do that make a big difference, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So, for example, one of the things I would do in my daily regime, when an inmate would walk in to participate, I would say, how you doing, Mr. Last Name here? How's your morning been going for you? How's your afternoon? How's your day been going for you? And it would disarm them immediately. You could see it in their faces.
Okay.
Because they're not usually asked by someone, that isn't, parole or something like that, how their day is going on those instances.
So simple, but
So simple.
Yeah.
And I didn't really think about how impactful it was until I was at my third prison, and I was doing these recruitment meetings. And a person that I was kind of sharing a wall with, if you will, in the room next to the room that I was doing the recruitment, came around after I finished one of the meetings, said, they must really like you. And I asked why. I was like, and they said, because you asked them how your day is going. And so it makes a big difference. And these are the things that I was very fortunate to learn ahead of time. I even went as far as to what clothes I wore.
Tell us a little bit about that. That's
at least in Pennsylvania, you have two colors that inmates will wear. You have the blues and then the browns.
Okay.
And then most guards wear gray. And so I would choose to avoid any of those colors.
And went in there with hot pink.
And went in there with hot pink, neon yellow. A very simple black T-shirt and blue jeans.
Okay.
But then I wear that. The number of black T-shirts I own right now are ridiculous. But I would wear that every day.
Yeah.
Because again, I'm providing consistency to them. I'm showing I'm exactly who I say I am, exactly who I am.
Was this something that you came up with yourself, or was this also like ideas that have been given to you?
This was something that kind of came up when I learned through informal conversations with other people that I thought it would be important.
Yeah.
I knew it was working actually about halfway through the first prison, so maybe only in participant number 25. I was walking out the day, I was getting escorted, so I was leaving the building that I was doing the study in, getting escorted to the main gate. And all of a sudden from a distance I hear, hey! And of course you're in a prison, so you're not going to ignore that in case you see what's going on. And I look and the guy is like, you that VR guy? And I say, yeah, that's me. He's like, all right, I'm going to get with you next week. How do I do it? And I told him who he should speak to. And so clearly I was developing a persona, which is very beneficial in these scenarios.
Word had gotten around about the VR guy dressed in black. Okay. Cool. If we talk now a little bit about the contact you've had, obviously, with prison staff and with prisoners. I'm guessing as the VR guy dressed in black, you have to walk a tightrope, right? I mean, you can't be seen to be too matey with anyone or chummy with anyone. How did you manage to build a rapport with both prisoners and prison guards without rubbing either up the wrong way?
Exactly. I mean, you have to really balance a tightrope. You have to be liked both by the inmates and by the guards, but loved by neither.
Nice way to put it.
If you look too pleasantly, if inmates like you too much, the guards won't help you.
Okay.
If the guards like you too much, the inmates won't participate.
Oh, tightrope indeed.
Yeah. And so there's lots of things that I kind of considered for that, but what I found the most interesting was guards were just as suspicious of me as inmates were.
About
what I was doing there,
doing.
Why I was there, who I was.
Were you seen as an interruption?
So a lot of the times from the guard's perspective, I was kind of seen...
Or an inconvenience.
An inconvenience, that's the best way to describe it. Guards make it run smooth. As I was talking earlier, they're the ones that have to call down, make sure the inmate's there. So I want them to like me because that's when if they call the first time and the inmate doesn't show up, they'll call the second time, the third time, the fourth, because I can't do these things.
Yeah.
So they have to like me to really do that kind of legwork for me in those instances. But at the end of the day, I am an interruption. I am an inconvenience because I'm someone they have to make sure they keep an eye on and keep safe.
Yes, okay.
So, for example, one of the things that I ran across was count time. Count time is exactly what it sounds like. A certain number of times a day at a certain time of day, the entire prison stops, and they count the number of inmates to make sure everyone's accounted for where they're meant to be at that time.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So if I have an inmate with me that is in the building that I am, and they're not typically there, the guard that's overseeing that building doesn't like this extra plus
suddenly
one.
leads to, the +1 and the -1 somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which is probably even a bigger problem in the prison.
Which everything, on the paperwork, it's all there. They're where they're meant to be, but if you normally have 37 people and you have 38, that 38th is really annoying you that day. So they want us to run smoothly. So we worked together to make sure I would get people early enough that they would be done just before count. Mm-hmm. That would give me enough time. Count only lasts 15 to 30 minutes.
Okay.
Enough time to reset and get the next guy as soon as count ends.
Okay.
And that way I don't end up sitting around. Because if I finish with the participant, but count has started, they just have to sit in the hallway for half an hour. And then I can't get another participant for however long until count ends.
So you try to be as convenient as possible.
Yeah.
With these kind of timing your interviews accordingly.
Yeah. And so I remember I was leaving one day, and I'd probably been at this prison for almost 3 weeks, getting towards the end of the time there. And I was leaving, and the guard at the gate said, "Oh, I forgot you were here." And my thought was, exactly. That's what I want to happen.
That's what you want to happen, yeah.
I want you to forget I'm here.
Okay.
Because that's when everyone's the happiest, I think. But curiosity always gets everyone. The guards were just as curious as they were suspicious. So they would always ask me questions about, what are you finding out? What are you learning? Things like that. That really helps win them over, to help me with the study. I would give them a little bit of a gist of what I was learning, mainly from what I'd already read from the literature, but also just kind of some anecdotal stuff. But you don't want to ever feel like you're betraying the trust of an inmate or speaking too soon before you really get to the results of your analysis.
And these were obviously not discussions, more water cooler discussions, so to say, where you weren't obviously sitting down with.
No.
That's right. Because again, that would breach.
It would just if an inmate saw me sitting down with the guards, kind of that formally or informally, that would raise flags for them. Is he really not from this state? Is he really coming from a research institute if he's doing this?
Yep.
So it was usually when I would be escorted. Whoever was escorting me, they would always ask questions. So that was interesting. So in addition to having the guards be on my side to help run things smoothly, I also obviously have to make the study attractive to the inmates to make them want to participate. And so to not look like a guard or not look like part of the system was very important.
Yeah.
But another thing was to also make sure people felt safe when they were with me. Make sure that they felt that they were going to be safe when we had that first recruitment meeting. I remember one inmate...
Physically safe or...
That they weren't going to get in trouble.
Oh, okay, for what they might say or do. Yeah.
And people, when they hear that, they automatically think, they don't want to incriminate themselves. That's true, but they also don't want to get in trouble with other inmates. If you look like you're snitching, if you look like you're rolling over, if you look like you're helping the system, then inmates might look down on you for that. I actually had one inmate in our recruitment meeting. He said, I love what you're saying. I love the project. He was like, but I'm worried what's going to happen to me when I go back to the block if they see me talking to you. Okay. He said, so I'm going to sit on it. I'm going to wait. I'm going to see what happens to other people when they participate. If they get called up at parole for something, or if they get, ran on at the block, then I'm not going to do it, but I'll let you know. And obviously, none of these things that, to my knowledge, ever happened. For one, I know nothing ever happened with parole because parole never even had the list of names of who participated. But unfortunately, I didn't get to see that inmate again because by the time I would have had space for him, my schedule was already full.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But that's a valid point. I mean, that's right. That winning of trust.
Yeah, and then once you get them in the room, that feeling of trust is 10 times more important.
Yeah,
they still haven't told me anything yet. They're just willing to be there. And, they might be telling me things that they've never told anyone. They might be admitting to crimes that haven't come to light yet. They do get quite emotional. So I have to take the time to speak with everyone so that they feel heard, that what they're saying is important, but I still also have an agenda. I have an hour and a half to 2 hours before I need to start getting to the next guy in here. Yeah. And so to do that tactfully is a little skill you learn through error. Because you never want to deflect and say, okay, but enough about that. Let me ask you what mine is.
No, that's right, And obviously, sometimes you're one of the only faces from the outside that some of the inmates would have seen. I mean, obviously, some get guests from outside, but visitors from outside, but some probably don't, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Yeah, okay.
And as you kind of heard earlier in my miniature pitch, if you will, when you make someone feel like an expert,
Yeah.
And, they don't get that a lot on the inside.
No.
Being told that they are an expert, that they're clever, that they have a skill set that no one else has.
Yeah.
That really gets them talking, not in a show-offy way.
No, sure.
But in a show-offy way.
Yeah. And as I say, I think also about, we're doing this to help you and to help, the neighborhoods where you're from. I mean, I think that's...
Yeah. And then for some inmates, it was really important to, I was just said show-offy. Some people conflate that with doing something good.
Yeah.
And I would make it very clear. I was like, we're not talking about right, wrong, good, bad. We're talking about a skill. Mm-hmm. A skill that I want to learn more about, hear more about. Because they don't necessarily like the things that they've done in the past.
Right.
The large majority found it very hard to talk about these things, not for incriminating, but because they felt guilt. Mm-hmm. And so I had to separate that guilt from them so they would open up and talk about it a little bit. And so when I say, I'm not here about right, wrong, good, bad, I'm not perfect. I have my spots in the past. I'm not going to be the first one to judge you.
Yeah.
But I need to learn. You going to teach me?
Yeah. Damn. Well, Patrick, normally we'd have to say bye-bye and end an interview here, and we'll have to do that for this podcast, but I'm so happy that we're doing 2 podcasts out of this.
Me
because
too.
You can just come back and tell us exactly about what you had and the experience of running the interviews there. So I guess that concludes episode 1 of this double feature. I hope you can join us again for part 2 to find out more about the virtual world that Patrick had the inmates traverse, as well as the preliminary findings from the study and even some more of his personal reflections on the time in the field. Thank you for listening to today's program. If you would like to hear additional podcasts or learn more about our research, please visit our website at www.csl.mpg.de.